now resumed.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions for the panel. Ms. Mack will be going next.
Thank you, Mr. McGowan.
The last name is Mack, M-A-K, first initial E, counsel for Metro Vancouver. I just have a few clarification points and for Dr. Van Rootselaar to expand on a couple of points made during his examination in chief. Dr. Van Rootselaar, at the beginning of your evidence, you briefly discussed Metro Vancouver and the nature of the acronyms, Greater Vancouver Regional District, GVRD, and GVS and DD. Just for the benefit of the Commission, could you just provide a little bit more explanation about what you meant by the term member municipalities and the phrases drainage district or sewage areas?
Yes, if you look at the Metro Vancouver area, the Metro Vancouver member municipalities make up those parties that are served by the services provided by Metro Vancouver in terms of wastewater treatment in the case of the GVS and DD. The areas, the sewerage areas are relative to the particular wastewater treatment plant that's served by that sewerage area. So in the case of Iona, the Vancouver sewerage area would be Vancouver and a piece of Burnaby, and I believe a piece of Richmond is included in that sewerage area, but largely the city of Vancouver. If you're looking at Annacis, the sewerage area includes a large number of different municipalities in that sewerage area. Lions Gate is on the North Shore, so it's the North Shore municipality served by that sewerage area. And the Lulu is served Richmond.
You had also made reference to the board. Can you just expand on who comprises the board and how the voting structure and financing scheme work?
Yes, the board is made up of members from and individuals from the member municipalities. Now, depending on the weighting, different municipalities have different voting levels on the board, but basically then in total that board then just determines what it wants to do. Now in the case of the GVS and DD, that's not the Metro Vancouver or GVRD board, that's the GVS and DD board that makes determinations with respect to the wastewater treatment systems. I guess it's important to note, I mean, these board members are coming from the councils and include mayors from those member municipalities that have to provide the finances that are required to fund these various infrastructure works for the various sewerage areas. Now, in the case of Iona, the way the structure is set up, a very large proportion of the cost there would go to those individuals living in the Vancouver sewerage area in terms of that upgrade. So again, in terms of the concerns of members of that area, I mean, they'd be looking at a very significant financial implication in terms of their occupants and you know, the effect that this would have in terms of the people living in that area and their resistance to a very large rate hit. So that's all part of that whole sewerage area question.
While we're on the topic of the City of Vancouver, it's probably the municipality where there's the most interest with respect to combined sewer overflows and CSO separation. You mentioned it briefly this morning, but just for the benefit, very briefly, could you just describe what the process would be for CSO separation within the City of Vancouver?
Yeah, the combined sewers are present in those municipalities that are the oldest municipalities in the Lower Mainland, and so consequently, Vancouver, the City of Vancouver, is one of those with part of Burnaby, and New Westminster is the other area that's very old and consequently has combined sewers, because back in the 50s, this was the normal way that sewers were built. Basically, they were designed to carry both sanitary sewerage and stormwater, and consequently to then separate those systems to get the sanitary sewage going to the wastewater treatment plant and the stormwater being diverted requires that the whole system from every street in the combined sewerage area has to be separated. And I mean, one approach would be you have to separate the whole system before you would have a truly separated system. But I mean, that's a huge job and highly disruptive. So the way it's typically done is you're doing a certain section, you then have to design so you can take the sanitary sewerage from that section. You can't put it back into the rest of your system, which may still be combined sewerage. You now have to relay it in some fashion to the wastewater treatment plant, and also you have to provide a proper location for stormwater discharge. So this is a very complex, highly disruptive process that Metro Vancouver is working on. And in the original plan, they basically had a timeline going to 50-50 for, 2050 for
That's a long plan.
that would be a long plan. 2050 for complete separation of that system, because it's not a simple piece. It's not just the cost, although the cost in total would rival the cost of a wastewater treatment plant of around $1 billion, but it's also the disruptive nature of the whole process.
So just following on your earlier description of the relationship between member municipalities and the Greater Vancouver Sewerage and Drainage District, is it fair to say that the upgrades to Iona would be borne by the City of Vancouver, primarily as a member of the Vancouver Sewerage Drainage District, as well as the costs of CSO separation through the City of Vancouver's own responsibility to separate?
To a large extent, that's correct.
I also want to take you to the policy and planning report that's been prepared for the Commission. I take it you've read that report, Dr. Van Wisler?
I went through it, yes.
Mr. Lund, could I ask you to bring that PPR up to page 34? And you could zoom in on paragraph 85, please. The intention of the policy and planning report is to speak in broad strokes to provide some background information for the Commission. And there's a general statement here at paragraph 85 that municipal governments across Canada have the mandate to provide sewage treatment as well as to control discharges into the sewer systems. And I just want to get into a little bit more detail about the latter part of that sentence, which is the ability to control discharges into the sewer systems. My hope is that with the benefit of your explanation, Doctor, the Commissioner's recommendations can be appropriate to the various levels of government that are involved with sewage, the control of discharge to sewer. So could you, from an operational perspective, describe what happens when the toilet flushes with a private lateral all the way to the treatment system?
Right. Yeah, what 85 refers to is municipal governments across Canada, and the GVS and DD and GVRD are not municipal governments; they're regional. And GVS and DD provides a regional service of wastewater treatment to member municipalities. So in fact, those members are municipal governments. This creates an additional level of complexity to the system, in that the sewerage from the member municipalities are then collected in trunk sewers that belong to the GVS and DD and are conveyed to the wastewater treatment plants that are owned and operated by the GVS and DD. Where this adds the additional complexity is that GVS and DD does not have control of the municipal sewers. The individual municipalities, in fact, control those municipal sewers. The other thing is that the individual municipalities also have the responsibility with respect to the private properties that connect into those municipal sewers. So therefore, you know, if somebody was going to take action with respect to, as you called them, private laterals, or the sewers that go from, for instance, in terms of a home, from the home to the street where it hooks up into the municipal sewer, that would be the municipality that would have to take that, and that would have that authority, not the GVS and DD. The GVS and DD's responsibility only comes into effect at the point where the municipal sewers discharge into the sewers of Metro Vancouver. So the other difficulty there is, of course, is that the GVS and DD doesn't therefore manage the discharge into those municipal sewers. They don't directly deal with the content of those sewers, including both in terms of volumes and constituency. We get sort of what's delivered to us from our member municipalities, and then we have to deal with that through our wastewater treatment plants.
At yesterday's commission hearings, the commissioner heard about the notion of source control, and that it's been suggested as a way to reduce the introduction of contaminants into the waste stream. You've now provided an explanation of how the wastewater flows, literally, to the GVS and DD wastewater treatment plants. How does this type of system affect the ability to use source control from a regulation and enforcement perspective? And by that I mean Metro Vancouver's ability to use regulation and enforcement to control the source.
Well, okay, there's two aspects now. Metro Vancouver has a regulation and enforcement division that deals with regulation of ICI sector, institution, commercial, and it then regulates those. But even there is limited in the sense that in the City of Vancouver, the City of Vancouver has its own enforcement officers. So again, there's a shared jurisdiction there. So the problem, however, with that kind of regulation is that by the time that something comes into Metro Vancouver's sewer and we realize that there might be a concern, trying to trace that back to where it came from, and secondly, if you can, getting the burden of proof in terms of taking action and even, you know, getting a conviction and assuming the success of getting conviction after you've gone through all these other hoops of trying to track it, you know, is the penalty sufficient to deter? So you know, that's a difficulty in that end. Then on the individual household end, even more difficult in the sense that we don't control those discharges in any direct way. And what we try to do with respect to the public, to the individual householders, is apply sort of the tools of moral suasion, where we put in programs that try and educate the public in terms of the consequence of their discharge. But that's a very indirect way of trying to affect behavior to solve the problem. So, you know, in case of, let's say, pharmaceuticals, one area that we are looking at there is working with the Pharmaceutical Association, the druggists and so on, in terms of return programs of those pharmaceuticals. Don't flush them down your toilet if you have leftover pills. We don't want to see them there. We don't want them in the system. So we have that kind of a program, like I say, of moral suasion. But then you also have to realize in the case of those kind of things, that when people are taking their medication, and certainly very difficult to to say you can't have your medication, when that medication is taken, a certain proportion of that medication will pass through and be excreted from that individual into the sewer system, and only a portion of that medication will actually make it into the body to do what it was designed to do. So again, even in that case, we still have the consequence that in our sewers, we have these kind of materials that are going to be carried, and to the degree that we can deal with them, we try to deal with them, but you know, those are not necessarily easily to deal with types of substances that we have there.
Before we took a break, Dr. Van Rootselaar, you were providing the Commissioner with some information about Metro Vancouver's environmental monitoring program and the cautions, warnings, and triggers document. I just want to back it up for a moment. If you could describe how the environmental monitoring program came about, and what are the components and what's involved in carrying out that type of extensive monitoring program.
The program itself came out of a requirement, although we were doing some monitoring before that, came out of a requirement in the 2002 Liquid Waste Management Plan. And there was also a requirement in that 2002 plan to then submit to the province by 2004, the beginning of 2004, a process by which this monitoring information would be used to determine what effect was being had on the environment by the various parameters that were being monitored. So to do that, we worked with the Environmental Monitoring Committee, and we worked through various stages of the initial monitoring program, and certainly the first one that was of prime focus was to design the best possible monitoring program for Iona. And we went through the Environmental Monitoring Committee and worked with the Environmental Monitoring Committee to see what that would look like, and to develop that, and that then resulted in the cautions, warnings, and triggers document that was provided to the provincial government, submitted to the provincial government in 2004, and that was accepted. So the components of the monitoring program are looking at the water column, they're looking at the benthos, they're looking at the sediment, and we also have fish surveys as well.
And just in terms of a sense of scale or order of magnitude, how much does it cost? And I'm just asking for ballparks, but to understand how extensive this program is, how much does it cost, the people power involved with running this kind of program? Could you just comment on that?
It's in the millions. I mean, if you look at the cost of the hiring of the consultants to undertake the studies, the Metro Vancouver staff that manage the programs, and the laboratory costs for the various analyses that have to be undertaken, this is a program that runs in the order of probably $3-4 million.
And how do you distinguish the environmental or do you distinguish the environmental monitoring program from scientific research?
Oh, definitely. If you look at the conditions of the approval letter from the minister in 2002 for the Liquid Waste Management Plan at that time, there was a number of different conditions, and there was one condition in particular, I believe it was condition 7, where there was a whole range of aspects that the condition asked Metro Vancouver to develop a program for. And that was a challenge, because the thing is that those were really in the purview of researchers, and Metro Vancouver is a service provider. We're not a research facility. We don't provide those kinds of, we don't have those kind of skills in terms of research. We look to universities and government research agencies to provide that. So that was a bit of a challenge, and so what we thought about was, well, how can we satisfy that condition? How can we look at things like genomics, EDCs, various types of things like that, which are sort of cutting edge and even now highly under development. How can we satisfy that? So we went back to the Environmental Monitoring Committee, and what we said is that we propose that the way to satisfy that is that we collaborate with, that we work with the universities, we work with the government research agencies to undertake those studies that are relevant, because these are pieces of research work. So we have, provided some funding, and we cooperate with the various research facilities and agencies in the area. I guess one example would be work we're doing with SFU, where Dr. Francis Law, a toxicologist at SFU, is working on a yeast assay looking at estrogen type compounds that might be significant, and developing testing protocols on that. Now, the latest piece of that work is where we're cooperating also with Environment Canada. There's currently an Environment Canada study going on, directed or managed by, I believe it's Dr. Shirley Ann Smith, where she's looking at different wastewater treatment plants across the country in terms of different types of plants and how they might be responding to the input of different types of organics, these various organics that have been mentioned, like the pharmaceuticals, the personal care products, and to see how those might be responding. So again, we're cooperating there. In that case, we sort of acted as a middleman, where Dr. Law is now doing samples from across the country.
Those are my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Mayor.
Mr. Commissioner, Mark East for the Department of Justice, Government of Canada. I'm here with my co-counsel, Geneva Grande McNeil. I just have a few questions. I have been allotted 25 minutes. I'll keep to that timeline. I just have a few questions, actually, for Mr. Arnott, and it's mostly going to relate to a couple of documents, and primarily one document. And that's the RIAS, or the regulatory, the regulations and the regulatory impact analysis statement. That's the exhibit 1047. Tab 6 of the Commission's list of documents. Mr. Arnott, we kind of jumped into the topic, and I just want to step back a bit, the topic of the regulations, and maybe ask you some questions about the policy challenges and policy purposes of the regulations. And I think the regulatory impact statement perhaps provides a good foundation for that. I'd like to go first to page 12 in ringtail in the document. And near the bottom it says under status quo, and the heading above that is regulatory and non-regulatory options considered, and there's a discussion of the status quo. And then starts off by noting subsection 36.3 of the Fisheries Act. Then in the last 5 lines from the bottom, I'd like to read this line. This current prohibition, section 36 sub 3, is not always aligned with the regulatory regimes of the provinces and territories. It has resulted in various levels of wastewater treatment across Canada, which means that Canadians do not necessarily enjoy similar levels of benefits. I'd like to stop there. From your perspective, in Ottawa, in the Government of Canada, a national, looking at this, is the national perspective on these issues of wastewater regulation something that you are particularly looking at in these regulations?
Yes, and in terms of the broad context, I think a couple of those sentences in the status quo part of the regulatory impact analysis statement does provide a backbone for what led to the conversation again with the provinces and territories about how all jurisdictions should come together and try to figure out a way through the issues of different levels of requirement that existed across the country, and try to construct a harmonized framework that we could all act under in a consistent way. So that's what led to the development of the Canada-wide strategy through CCME. In our view, it does provide that framework, that harmonized framework, to act both in terms of establishing national effluent quality standards, as well as a framework to continue to work together in terms of the implementation of the federal reg, along with the existing provincial frameworks that are in place.
Okay, thank you. And then actually the next page, at the bottom, page 13. because the last two sentences on page 13. Again, we obviously in this process we've been focused on Pacific Coast and the Vancouver area, especially with respect to municipal wastewater. The last two sentences, though, without a nationally consistent regulatory approach, it would be much more difficult to ensure that all Canadians enjoyed a similar level of protection for their water resources. As such, the proposed regulations have been developed to achieve the desired objective. And focusing on the desired objective, is the message here that the purpose of these regulations is to provide national baseline standards for municipal wastewater treatment?
Correct, and I'd also take you to the first sentence under regulatory measures, where the regulations were considered as the best option for achieving the objective of reducing those risks to ecosystem health, fish resources, and human health posed by wastewater effluent.
And this, it was in terms of your consultation and stakeholder feedback, I take it there wasn't any serious disagreement from the stakeholders that these harmonized regulations were not a good idea.
No, I think there was broad support for, especially the jurisdictions working together to come up with both national baseline standards that could be achieved over time, as well as a broader approach to continued cooperation and collaboration by the senior levels of government.
And perhaps we can go to page 9 of this document. And second to last paragraph, starting with the word despite. And I think this perhaps echoes some of what Dr. Rutzler was saying about the local situation, but here I'm interested in this paragraph. Despite the increase in public infrastructure investment over the past decades, Canada's wastewater systems are aging. A large percentage of these were constructed in the 1960s, and as of 2007, it was estimated that many facilities had passed over 60% of their useful life nationally. Thus, significant new investment will be required for this sector in the near future. Is this one of the major considerations that were facing you in developing these regulations?
I would say it was certainly a significant factor in developing the regulations in the context of implementation. I think one of the broad issues we heard through consultation was the need to construct regulations that reflected national standards that took into account the fact that new investments were going to be required for older and aging facilities, and that we should take that into account in terms of implementation.
And if you go over to the next page, page 10, there's an interesting map of Canada. And it talks about, I guess, where you get the darker color. And looking over at the charts, the proportion of served population with less than secondary treatment. And you look over British Columbia, we're kind of in the middle between the 10 to 50% range. What this seems to suggest that there is a wide variation nationally in the levels of treatment.
Yes, that's correct.
And if you go up to the paragraph right above the map, actually, even the last sentence of the previous paragraph, it talks about, at this point, 3.2% of the population served by sewer systems still had no treatment for their wastewater effluent. And then continuing, additionally, the degree of wastewater treatment varies greatly across Canada. For instance, there are much lower treatment levels to releases to coastal waters than inland freshwaters. And then there's a reference to the map. I'm interested too, and it says with respect to British Columbia, additionally, British Columbia has approximately 36% of the served population receiving less than secondary treatment. So again, I guess would this reinforce the theme that one of the primary purposes of these regulations is to ensure a harmonization nationally?
Yes, a harmonization nationally, and as well, the CCME Canada-wide strategy does provide that harmonized framework for both, in this case, British Columbia to act provincially, and for the federal government to act through the regulations that we're developing.
I'd like to move on to another topic in the same document, however, and that's at page 7 in Ringtail.
Sorry,
Page 7 in Ringtail. at the bottom, start at the bottom. And there's been a lot of questions about environmental effects monitoring, and I just want to make sure that we're not mixing two different concepts here. The regulations deal with, well, first of all, let's look at the heading here, effluent monitoring. And perhaps I can read this and ask you to comment. Effluent monitoring and reporting requirements are also specified under the proposed regulations. Owners or operators of, and go over to the next page, wastewater systems would be required to install, maintain, and calibrate monitoring equipment to monitor the volume and composition of the effluent. And it talks a little bit more about this requirement in the regulations. This is not the same as the environmental effects monitoring that we've been discussing. Is that right?
That's correct. In this case, these provisions as contemplated would apply to all wastewater systems under the regulations.
And these aren't the regulations that would expire after a 2-year period of time. These are ongoing?
These are ongoing, and they would be consistent and would be maintained.
Thank you. The next paragraph does talk about the receiving environment monitoring, as they call it here, also defined as environmental effects monitoring. A couple of things about this, and we've had some discussions about this, and there's 2 questions I just want to follow up on. I think earlier on in your testimony, Mr. McGowan asked you about emerging contaminants concerns, and I think you indicated that, well, we'll get back to this, but there's elements of looking at these contaminants in the context of environmental effects monitoring. And forgive me if I missed it, but I don't believe you got back to that. Did you want to add to that as far as whether or not this monitoring will take into account contaminants other than the ones prescribed in the regulations?
Right. So within the provisions that are proposed, it does include other parameters to monitor. So under the theme that's characterized in this paragraph, water quality monitoring, there are other substances that would be required to be monitored within these provisions, as well as some of the other activities that are required for environmental effects monitoring, like monitoring benthic and in some cases, fish populations. So the broader issues that might be contemplated under that water quality monitoring are issues of some emerging substances, especially as it relates to endocrine function, as well as looking at issues related to nutrient inputs to a particular receiving environment. And that's why you'll see in the specific provisions requirements for parameters that relate to nutrient loadings.
And we heard some testimony from Dr. Van Brusselaar about the purposes for which Metro Vancouver does environmental effects monitoring. What is, in the context of these regulations, what's the purpose of the environmental effects monitoring?
Yes, and it's a bit different in our context of why we would propose receiving environment or environmental effects monitoring provisions. In this case, it really is to evaluate the effectiveness of the effluent quality standards that are within the regulations and looking specifically at protecting fish and fish habitat. So it's designed as a performance measure for the regulations, and I should also be clear that these additional receiving environment monitoring requirements would only be for those wastewater systems that are already meeting the secondary wastewater treatment effluent quality standards. It would not apply to those that still need to upgrade, because as I spoke to, really these additional requirements are looking at the effectiveness of the regulations within the context of achieving those effluent quality standards, those baseline effluent quality standards.
Staying on the same topic, you alluded earlier, or referred to earlier, to some of the lessons learned from some of the other regulations under the Fisheries Act that have environmental effects monitoring. Are those references to the pulp mill effluent regulations and the metal mining effluent regulations?
That's correct.
And what are some of the lessons learned, I suppose, from those processes that made its way into these regulations?
Well, I think the lessons learned get reflected directly into what we proposed, in the sense that I would characterize it as two main features where, as proposed, the environmental effects monitoring requirements are targeted at a subset of the entire sector. In this case, the wastewater sector is much different than the industrial sectors that are regulated under those regulations that you mentioned. So we did have to contemplate a specific subset, and we proposed a risk-based approach to identify what we felt the right system should do these additional environmental effects monitoring requirements. That's number one. I think number two is the lessons learned about making sure that we've got the appropriate kinds of requirements for environmental effects monitoring, and that there is a start and a finish to these requirements, because at the end of the day, they are designed to be a performance check. We think, as proposed, the information that would be collected through the phase that's proposed would inform future amendments to the regulation, future amendments to both environmental effects monitoring provisions as well as the effluent quality standards. And we wouldn't need to have the endless cycle of feedback for that purpose. We'd be contemplating those amendments based on what's proposed.
I want to move now to some of the regulations, performance measurements requirements. And the easiest way to do this perhaps is to go to page 31 in Ringtail. And perhaps I'd like to go to the last paragraph on page 31. Sorry, I'm going to back up. Maybe go up to under the heading Performance Measurement and Evaluation. And in this paragraph, if I'm reading this correctly, there's paragraphs relating to the immediate, intermediate, and final outcomes of these regulations. Could you talk a little bit as to particularly what these stages of outcomes are?
Certainly. Within the broad context of these regulations and developing a regulatory impact analysis statement, the basis for the text that we're talking about currently, the contemplation of a lot of these features that are described here relate to requirements that we face under Treasury Board Secretariat within the federal government. When any federal department contemplates regulations, regulations go through a process designed by Treasury Board. And in this case, this regulation has a high regulatory impact, and we do have to contemplate in quite a bit of detail features like a performance measurement and evaluation plan. So as described here, there's different phases of how we would measure specific outcomes of the regulation, and that includes features like, as described in the second paragraph there, where we're determining a percentage of the regulated community that's reporting on time, and in terms of whether that regulated community is in compliance with the effluent quality standards. So we've had to contemplate a measurement and evaluation plan that includes all the various steps in terms of establishing a new regulation and how it would get implemented over time.
And then leading to my next question, which is the last paragraph. In the first sentence is, the proposed regulations would require regulatees to submit reports through an electronic reporting system developed by Environment Canada. Has that been developed, or is that being developed now?
Yes, it is being developed. We see it as a key feature of moving forward in terms of implementing the federal regulations, as well as a key feature of establishing bilateral agreements with provinces in terms of that regulatory reporting for municipalities and others that have to report under the regulations. I should also add that the federal government developing an electronic reporting system was a commitment that we made under the CC McCandaway strategy as well.
Okay. And internally, more to government, I suppose, further down in the paragraph, starting on the line that says annual reports. Annual reports based on the routine reporting required by the proposed regulations would also be produced and made publicly available In addition, the effectiveness of the national effluent quality standards in protecting fish and fish habitat would be evaluated through environmental effects monitoring studies and reported on by Environment Canada. I think the first sentence is relatively straightforward. Can you talk a little bit about what's anticipated in the second sentence?
Well, I think we've spoken to that a few minutes ago. In terms of how we would situate future amendments to the regulations, we'd certainly be looking at the environmental effects monitoring information studies, the data that's reported there. I think it's just in terms of reporting back out, Environment Canada typically reports back out publicly summaries of those requirements, in this case, the environmental effects monitoring provisions.
And just maybe my last line of questions on this document. I just want to talk a little bit about the cost-benefit discussion. And maybe start with page 2 of the document. Now, my understanding is that with these regulatory impact statements, there's quite, I think, a mandated cost-benefit analysis that goes into any kind of regulatory regime.
That's correct. Yes.
And under the heading cost-benefit statement, you can zero in on that. On the second line, while the estimated costs of the proposal are significant, in the order of $5.9 billion in discounted 2010 dollars, the overall quantified benefits are almost 3 times this amount, totaling $17.6 billion. This results in a benefit to cost ratio of almost 3 to 1 for the country as a whole. I take it this is considered a good ratio?
It is a good ratio. Within the context of what Treasury Board expects departments to do in terms of a benefit cost calculation, they are looking for a broad national check on those issues, not designed necessarily to contemplate case-by-case or wastewater system-specific issues. That's recognized that they can be different. We did, in this case here, comments on the cost-benefit approach, but it really related to wastewater system or municipality-specific issues that could play into how the cost-benefit would play out case by case. But generally speaking, Treasury Board's looking for a broad national scope. That's what's contemplated here, and any ratio that gets close to 1 to 1 is the only time that there'd be pause to think about the regulatory approach.
And maybe just to probe into that a little bit further, I'd like to go to page 15. Again in Ringtail. And there's a Table 1 national ranking of wastewater facilities in Canada, for facilities requiring upgrades based on the national ranking system. And I think maybe we've had this in evidence already, but it says here British Columbia, 5 medium risk upgraded by 2030, 8 high risk upgraded by 2020. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that's correct. And I should add, the table as presented was based on the existing information that was available by any means that we had. And as we've spoken to already today, these numbers would not get finalized until the regulations are actually finalized.
Okay. And so going further down, there's another Table 2. Again, that's a restatement of what we already said. Benefits to cost ratio, total benefits over 17 billion, total cost almost 6 billion, the benefit to cost ratio 3 to 1. Are you familiar with, well, first of all, maybe I ask this question. On page 16, next paragraph, next page, sorry. Wastewater system costs, and this is where it talks about second paragraph. The total cost to the wastewater system owners and operators are estimated to be $5 billion discounted to 2010 dollars, and it breaks it down a bit more. That's based on a standard of secondary treatment. Is that
That's
right?
correct, yes.
So these numbers would not necessarily be the same if there was if there were upgrades or expected upgrades to more we sometimes call advanced treatment facilities.
Advanced or tertiary, yes, that's correct.
Okay.
I should,
also-
sorry, I should
Yeah.
also add that we did hear comments in terms of the way the numbers are characterized in the regulatory impact analysis statement, in terms of it being labeled as discounted to 2010 dollars. If these were not discounted numbers, they'd be higher, which reflects some of the other estimated values in the range of 10 to 13 billion in undiscounted terms, just to make that distinction between two ways of representing these kind of numbers.
Okay. My final question on this one goes to page 19 of Bringtail. And under table 3, present net value, net benefits, and proposed regulations broken down by jurisdiction, there's a line that talks about cost, capital cost, O&M, non-capital, cost of government. And then the benefits, and it's interesting here, looking under the BC line, are you familiar with how they identified the benefits? Like, I'm curious as to what WTP means. Willingness to pay.
Willingness to pay, yeah. I mean, in terms of the economists that are responsible for these kind of calculations, there's a number of ways that they would approach this calculation. Within the context of this sector, there was a, how would I say, a factor that was used in the calculation of willingness to pay calculation, or a factor in the calculation where, given this is a publicly owned, publicly operated sector, some of the issues have come up already during testimonies today. That was factored into how the benefit cost was calculated.
Okay. Anyway, at the far right column, the number there for net benefits to BC, as reflected in the willingness to pay principle and the property value increase, is over $5 billion in British Columbia.
Yes, correct.
The final question, and just as my last one, and this is actually related to tab 5, exhibit 1058. In the Canada-wide strategy for the management of municipal water effluent, are you familiar with this document?
Yes.
Page 13 of Bringtail. There's a reference to a science and research heading. And it says, to promote coordinated research and disseminate information within the municipal wastewater effluent sector, a committee is needed. Such committee would track who is researching what has already been done, and what the key research priorities should be in the future. And going down to the bottom, the proposed committee would publicize projects and results to prevent duplication and to promote collaboration among researchers who would neither conduct nor fund research. Has this been set up?
Yes, it has. Within the context of CCB, there's 2 federal, provincial, territorial committees that are set up related to wastewater. One dealing with the implementation of the Canada-wide strategy for municipal wastewater effluent, as well as the committee that's set up to look at that Canada-wide approach being developed for wastewater biosolids. So under those 2 committees, there is now a 3rd committee set up to meet this commitment to better coordinate science and research amongst the jurisdictions. Environment Canada is leading that process in terms of making some next steps and contemplating the right model to establish in terms of figuring out research priorities and how to move forward. So yes, committee has been set up. They are moving forward in very early stages to deliver some results.
Thank you, Mr. Arnaud. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to suggest we break for the lunch break now. We will continue with this panel for 1 hour till the afternoon break, following which the gravel topic will commence.
Thank you very much.
We will now adjourn until 2 p.m.